Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Nita Farahany, who is a leading scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of emerging technologies. She is the Robinson O. Everett Distinguished Professor of Law and Philosophy at Duke Law School, the founding director of Duke Science and Society, the faculty chair of the Duke MA in Bioethics and Science Policy, and principal investigator of SLAP Lab. She is also the author of the new book, The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. Nita Farahany, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Nita, will cover your cognitive liberty concept as well as your new book. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your general comment about the cultural and social forces at work in today's modern society?
Sure. So, I think more than anything, the modern moment is the kind of era of the brain, the era of our cognitive and affective experiences. And I think more than anything, it's a moment at which those experiences are really at risk of being reshaped and redefined. We, as I think a human species in many ways, are in flux in our, kind of understanding of our ability to have cognitive freedoms, to understand what it means to be interacting more in a digital era and a digital age. And I think trying to understand what the limits of our cognitive abilities are, but also the limits of our abilities to have any kind of freedom or control over that is being shaped and reshaped in the modern moment. So it's a very interesting moment, but also I think for many people a scary moment in the kind of threats to cognitive liberty and freedom.
Do you consider yourself to be an optimist, or are you more pessimistic about where we are?
I am more optimistic than I probably was, say, a year ago, in that people are starting to recognize and participate more actively in the debate. I think that generative AI has really woken people up to disinformation and to influence campaigns and to the effects of algorithmic targeting of behaviors and manipulation of mental experiences and states and the addictive nature of technologies. And they're starting to ask the right questions about how do we start to rein some of the impacts of technology on our brains and mental experiences in to enable people to exercise better cognitive freedoms and kind of discovery of self and autonomy. At the same time, I'd say those tools are getting much more powerful. And so while I think people are starting to be much more attuned to the impacts of technologies, the technologies are going faster than people's awareness or ability to counteract or even develop the governance strategies or the personal strategies that we might implement to enable people to think freely. So I think I'm a little bit in equipoise rather than optimistic or pessimistic, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. Well, so the bio that I read at the top just a moment ago just gives a hint as to the breadth of your research efforts, but it really doesn't do it justice. Do you think maybe you could just give a whirlwind tour of the kinds of things that you've studied over your career, which might also help set the stage for the rest of the discussion?
Sure. So I'm sort of like a weird person in my background in that I have a legal background, a scientific background, and a philosophical background. And so I did, a JD, a PhD in the philosophy of science and law, and a master's in biology and neuroscience. And it's always been the intersection of behavioral sciences, law, and philosophy that I have really focused my scholarly efforts as well as my engagements with the world. And so I've, served on multiple different government committees and commissions that span from bioethics for, the president to, the National Institute of Neurological Disease and Stroke to serving as, commissioner from North Carolina for the Uniform Laws Commission, looking at updated understanding of neurological determinations of death and how that impacts our brains. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about the intersection of philosophy, law, and primarily neuroscience, the brain, and behavioral sciences of, how our kind of brains and mental experiences are impacted or being used or being applied in legal and ethical contexts.
Right. There's another a gentleman that I want to contact and try to get him onto the podcast, but I believe his focus. He's a philosopher of information.
Hmm.
Luciano Floridi. Does
I
that
haven't
name
come.
ring a bell to you?
Mm-mm.
But I'm I'm curious, I mean, so this is not something that we discussed in advance. So, but the philosophy of information
Mm-hmm.
itself,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on where the frontier is on our understanding of information, the concept of information?
Yeah. It's not my area of specialty. I'm
Hmm.
much more of a philosopher of mind, but those two
Okay.
things obviously intersect, right? In the ways in which that we're talking about it, which is what is the impact of information or stimulus? However you want to frame information, right? Whether information is images or text or speech or art or kind of any kind of input, and its impact on the brain and how we receive and understand and process information. And so I'd say on the philosophy of neuroscience side or philosophy of consciousness and mind, there is an intersection with obviously philosophy of information and kind of what information is and how we think about it, how we conceive of it, how we interpret it, how it's represented in the brain. But I would say my own expertise far more focuses on representation and impact on the brain. And, everything from if you're receiving information in a virtual world or in a virtual context, does your brain discriminate between it and, kind of the physical world? And it seems like largely no, right? Your brain
Mm,
experiences it very much similarly, whether it is a virtual representation or a physical representation of the same information or the same image. And so, what's the saying? Like perception is reality. For your brain, perception is reality. So to the extent that it's presented as real, right? So if you're
right.
encountering something in virtual reality, or even there have been interesting and in many cases, very disquieting and chilling studies about the impact of virtual assaults, for example, whether that's physical or sexual assaults in a virtual world, and how the brain processes and receives that information, and it experiences it very much in the same way as a physical or kind of real world experience. And so at least to the extent that studies have been done on this, most of the studies seem to show that the virtual experiences are experienced in much the same way, if not exactly the same way, in the brain as the physical or real world experiences.
Right. Are you aware of any research that has looked at uh, PTSD that is induced from virtual experiences, or even like kids or adults these days that are consuming information via technological channels?
I haven't dived into that on the PTSD in particular side. I have looked at trauma but not PTSD as a particular phenomena of trauma, right? Which is the kind of re-experiencing of trauma. And I do know that that there has been research on trauma experienced in virtual worlds and how that leads to, physical or kind of real world trauma when it's experienced in a virtual setting. I would imagine that could cause the same kind of lasting effects of PTSD as one would experience in the real world. I've, barely scratched the surface of some of the PTSD literature on therapeutics in virtual worlds, which is that you can use, virtual reality or use different kind of treatments through virtual re-experiencing of different memories as a treatment modality. And that, again, I've just scratched the surface. It's not my area of expertise, but.
Understood. Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about your book, The Battle for Your Brain, and we'll have a link in the show notes for those who wish to check it out further. But why did you write this book? And also maybe you could chat a little bit about your concept of cognitive liberty and why you think it's important.
Sure. So I wrote my book, The Battle for Your Brain, because of really two things. One was what I see as the final frontier for accessing and changing our brains, which is much more direct ways of doing so through brain sensors or neurotechnology. Most people who are listeners of this podcast will be deeply familiar with all the ways in which our brains can be accessed and changed through indirect measures, whether that's through information or through, the kind of digital worlds in which we exist. But most of those are still indirect measures, and there is a part of ourselves that we still hold back, that we don't express through words or actions, and kind of preserve in a kind of space of inner monologue or through what I think of as mental privacy. And as we move from a world that uses sensors for heart rate or for, footsteps or breaths or body temperature to a world in which brain sensors are used that can detect brain activity and decode brain activity, even to change brain activity much more directly, our final frontier of privacy or kind of a last space of mental reprieve, I see as being at risk. And so I wanted to describe the technological advances that were already happening in this space, and not just the ways in which it would be at risk in the future, but in which not yet at full societal scale, but already in a number of settings, from government settings to corporate settings to employment settings, that people were being subject to this kind of neural surveillance or brain surveillance. And then to try to use that both to help raise awareness about what was happening, but to establish the case for an international human right to cognitive liberty that would, kind of fill in the gaps, as I see it, to like kind of digital age technologies and the cognitive freedoms that we need in order to be able to navigate that space and continue to flourish.
Big wide open space for all kinds of follow-up questions. Could you describe maybe over, again, just like wave tops, but over the last, say, 20 years or so to today, what are some of the technological advancements that have come online or that are coming online that enable these kinds of, I don't know, more precise or intrusive measures of brain activity?
So, people again are familiar with sensors that are put into watches or rings that can detect body activity as heart rate or temperature or different movements that a person makes. And in the same way, sensors can be used to pick up electrical activity in the brain. And there's a lot of different neurotechnologies that I've written about over time that are much bigger and less likely to be part of our everyday lives. So things like functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, where a person goes into a giant MRI and through imaging and being shown different things like words or text or sounds, you can like a scientist can look at the blood oxygenation levels in the brain and then use advances in artificial intelligence and pattern recognition to decode what that means. But the kind of major advances that have happened over the past decade are the miniaturization of that. So instead of large clunky machines that can peer deeply into the brain, sensors that are applied to the scalp that pick up far less information than can be picked up from peering deeply into the brain, but still some information. And those sensors have gone from what are sensors that have to be applied over the entire scalp with gel to dry sensors that can rest on the forehead or behind the ear or touch, a part of the scalp and pick up electrical activity. That used to not do much because they're, you have to go through the thick skull to pick up the electrical activity in the brain. There is muscle movement and eye twitches that interfere with the signal that can be interpreted. But as advances in AI have made it possible to filter out some of the noise and to associate what were, kind of deeper, more precise measures of the brain with these less precise measures of the brain, but to kind of gather information, those advances have converged to give us small sensors embedded in everyday devices like earbuds and headphones or small wearable tattoos that allow somebody to, take a conference call or listen to music and at the same time have the electrical activity in their brain being picked up, and then AI decoding what that means to at least be able to decode basic brain states. Like, is a person happy or sad or paying attention? Is their mind wandering? What are their political biases? Things like that.
These wearable devices or the earbuds you were describing, are these things like still in R&D?
No, there are some of them. There are some already on the market. So
Is that right?
Most of the devices today, like literally, kind of today and, the earlier parts of 2023, are still in headbands, meaning instead of in earbuds or headphones, they're in headbands. And by headbands, I mean, they're in, kind of either a soft headband worn across the forehead, or they are in hard plastic headbands that have sensors that are applied to the forehead. But already, like I have in beta, some of the earlier ones that will launch later this year in 2023, there are Emotives MN8, which is earbuds that pick up electrical activity in the brain. And the hardware is already complete. I think they just haven't finished the companion app to launch that at scale yet. Or Neurable has headphones where the soft cups around the ears are packed full of sensors that pick up brain activity. And they've partnered with a major headphone manufacturer, and they plan to launch their product in early summer of 2023. And so these are products that already are shipping. They're already taking pre-orders and, are much more integrated. The watch that embeds a sensor into a watch to pick up brain activity as it goes from your brain down your arm to your wrist to pick up like your intention to type or swipe or move. That is likely to launch in early part of 2025. So Meta acquired a company called Control Labs, and Control Labs is the company that was kind of the most advanced in using electromyography or EMG to pack sensors into something like a watch that could be worn on the wrist to pick up peripheral brain activity. And again, that'll be more like an interface for other technology. So picking up your intention to move, swipe, type, and using that in the form of a watch. So all of this is, kind of arriving in early 2023 in these multifunctional devices all the way through, kind of, I'd say kind of 2025, 2026, we should see much wider scale adoption of this across society.
Have you personally experimented with any of these devices? Have you been surprised by what the devices are able to infer about your mindset when you're wearing them?
Yeah. So, what I haven't done is taken the devices and then clinically validate them. Right. And so I'm relying on, what an app says they say about my brain activity. And in those instances, I'm both surprised by the signal quality and that it seems to correlate pretty well with what my own subjective interpretation of my current mental state is. And so using it to track like focus and attention or meditation and stress levels, engagement, boredom, things like that, that can already be detected through these devices. And I've, had access to the earlier beta versions of both the earbuds as well as the headphones. And I was surprised by the sound quality, for example, of being able to listen to music, but also be able to see and visualize your brain activity at the same time. So,
Mm,
it's remarkable that, it in some ways it shouldn't be that surprising to us that given that there's sensors that pick up our heart rate and
mhm,
pick up
mhm.
every other aspect of our bodily function, it shouldn't be that surprising to us that brain activity could also be measured. But it is really strange because none of us currently track or accurately know what's happening in our own brains, and to suddenly have it be transparent and able to be visualized through an app, particularly when the content of what you're decoding is very different than a heart rate, right? It's your feelings, emotions, your intentions, your
Yeah.
preferences, your desires and biases. It's a very different experience to have that kind of content of self being decoded as opposed to, your heartbeat.
Son of a gun. Well, I can imagine how some sensors must work, like on a watch on your wrist. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I can see how well you can pick up on, heart rate and haptic, skin type reactions, which can then go into, assessing some kind of, how a person is feeling. But with the ear, like, at a big picture level, how does that even work? A sensor in the ear that helps make inferences about the brain. Do you have any like high level description on how that technology even works?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll say, as as we think, as we do anything, right? Neurons are firing in our brains, and as every time a neuron fires, it has just a tiny electrical discharge, and as you experience any thought or emotion or brain state, hundreds of thousands of neurons are firing concurrently, giving off those tiny electrical discharges. And those happen at different frequency bands, alpha, beta, theta, gamma, delta. And those different frequency bands can be detected by electrodes that pick up the both kind of amplitude and kind of frequency of the electrical activity that's happening in your brain. And with tiny sensors that are in each ear, how much you're picking up is very limited, right? Instead of picking up activity from across the entire scalp with many different sensors that are applied, you're picking up a narrower average of brain activity. And so you're getting less precise information from an electrode in each ear than you would across the entire scalp. And so what you're getting is an average of brain activity. And so you're getting basic brain activity like alpha, like how dominant is alpha versus beta versus delta, gamma, and theta. But those broad amplitudes and frequencies of different brain states are associated with things like paying attention or stress. And so it's picking up, like you're alpha dominant right now, or beta dominant right now. And then the kind of dominance of a particular frequency and amplitude of brainwave activity is associated with a basic brain state like paying attention or mind wandering, things like that.
Wow, that is amazing. Are there any technologies that you're aware of under development, which try to like harness like multiple sensor readings? So like I can
Oh, yeah.
imagine
Yeah.
that you would get a more precise estimate of someone's mindset if you're taking in like eye dilation data, this ear sensor stuff, this wrist sensors, and if you're able to combine all of that together, you can get a truer inference about what's going on.
Right. So definitely. And I think that's the future, right? It's not just brain sensors in isolation. it is multimodal sensors. So it's picking up everything from what are you seeing on your computer screen to what's your heart rate to eye tracking to muscle twitches to what your ring is saying about body temperature and kind of sweat or things like that. Just as an example, I recently was speaking at a conference where another speaker from a company called Open BCI was also speaking. And he was demonstrating their Vareo headset, or the Galia headset, which is it's a virtual reality headset that's packed with sensors. And those sensors include everything from ECG or heart rate readings to eye tracking to brain activity sensors. And it's using the combination of all of those sensors together with sensors like EMG, electromyography sensors that are picking up muscle activity on the body, to come up with much more precise measures of what is a person thinking or feeling. And, when you correlate all of those different measures together of, kind of a headset that's packed with sensors together with bodily sensors, the precision of the information is, substantially increased than just brain sensors alone. Then when you add to it what's happening in the environment and use that to probe the body for information, it becomes increasingly more precise still.
Back to your book, The Battle for the Brain. So that implies to me at least a contest. There must be some stakeholders who you have in mind who are battling over our brains. Could you talk about the stakeholders in this battle?
Sure. So we've just described a world in which increasingly what's happening in our brains can be quantified. And the question is, who wants to do that quantification and what do they want to do with that data? And so the battle for your brain describes a world in which we, as individuals, may want to have access to that information to be able to understand our own brain activity, to enhance it, to diminish it, to change it, right? To make choices over our self-determination. But already it's a world in which employers are trying to get access to that information to quantify workers' brain activity and their attention and fatigue levels and mind wandering or even cognitive decline or cognitive overload. Or corporations are trying to gain access to what's happening in people's brains to be able to micro-target advertisements, to addict people to technologies and to bring them to their platform over and again, or even to engage in influence campaigns, as we've seen with things like Cambridge Analytica or, Facebook's contagion experiment, where, they literally wanted to see if they could change the feed of people on their social media and if that could change and manipulate their behaviors and their emotions. To governments who are seeking access to brains to do everything from try to develop novel biometrics to authenticate people at borders, to interrogate criminal suspects' brains, or develop cognitive warfare campaigns to try to both influence but also disable and disorient brains. And so the battle is really, I think, the battle between individuals for autonomy and for self-determination over their own brains and mental experiences versus corporations versus governments who are trying to access, manipulate, and change our brains as well.
How do you take this whole discussion that we've been having, and you already started hinting at it a little bit, but how do you drop this into a national security context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at how NATO and how others have described the sixth domain of warfare, it's the human brain. And that's everything from influence campaigns to try to shape or reshape the way people think, to really direct kind of assaults on the brain. And that could be everything from an assault on the brain to distract people, right? I mean, the more people's productivity diminishes because they're distracted or unable to pay attention, or they are addicted to social media and other devices, it distracts them from being competitive and productive and flourishing. It leads to greater mental health problems and overall is anti-competitive in many ways, right? It diminishes a country's kind of national security interest in its people and in their people's ability to flourish. But it also means that, that's just the kind of influence of domination of the brain. There's also, discussion of weapons that countries are trying to develop to see if it's possible to uniquely target and disable and disorient the human brain. So the Biden administration issued sanctions against the Chinese government, against a number of firms in the Chinese government in December 2021 for purported development of brain control weaponry, or at least investment in it. There are anxieties about kind of a race to create supercomputers and brain computer interface, questions about whether or not there should be import and export bans on different components of brain computer interface, because of the cybersecurity risks that it might pose if people are using brain computer interface devices, and if other countries could have backdoors into it to directly either intercept or hack or change a person's brain. And then, there have been anxieties for a while around, kind of so-called Havana syndrome, which the intelligence community recently came out and said in the United States that they don't think that it was perpetrated by a foreign adversary. And at the same time, there are some unexplained cases of Havana syndrome, even within the broader context of most of those cases having been dismissed by the intelligence community as not actually being, driven by any kind of brain control weaponry. And so there's questions about, are there microwave or electromagnetic radiation or other technologies that are being investigated that potentially could damage the brain, and our governments investing in that? And do we need to be trying to safeguard against that, or developing, tools and capabilities to both detect it and to be able to safeguard against it? And so, that's the kind of broader context of both the battle, but also the national security implications of that battle that's happening.
Something that I've experienced is a slowing down of decision-making speed, or
Right.
a slowing down of believing what I read. I don't want to,
Yeah.
come off like I have always believed everything that I read, but
Yeah.
increasingly today, when I see something newsworthy, my initial thought is like, well, I'd better double check or triple check that.
Well, but that's good that you're thinking that, right? I mean, that means that you're engaging with critical thinking skills, right? But you're right, which is the flood of disinformation and misinformation is
Right.
part of
Yeah.
that influence campaign, but also part of the credibility question, right? I mean, like, how will you ever know what's real and what isn't real? And, the ability to use information warfare to discredit people or ideas, or to even just make it too cloudy for people to know what's true and what isn't true, so that there's so much noise that it's difficult for people to even process, let alone have access to accurate and true information.
You brought up earlier, or at least I think you mentioned, like Chat GPT or large language models, and that kind of
Mhm.
technology that is big time in the news these days. And I've wondered, kind of like, fast forward 50 years, let's just say,
Yeah.
but the historical record can be tainted by just like an overwhelming amount of deliberate false information that
Right.
goes into the public record by these AI generated content, right?
Mhm.
Or let's not say 50 years, but like 500 years, right? How would
Yeah.
somebody, a historian, in the relative distant future, know what is right or wrong, given the possibility of just flooding the record with all kinds of bogus information? And it also makes me, wonder, going back in history 1,000 years, what the saying is, victors write the history books or something like that. But how warped is our own sense of history, and how warping can the future glimpse at our time be based on these types of dynamics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And not one I had really thought about.
Yeah,
But
I understand. Yeah.
no, but I mean, it's not one that I thought about. And every time I have a conversation with somebody, there's some new facet to be scared about, and that's one of them, right? Which is, given how difficult of a time we are having right now in telling real from false information. When you have the precision of generative AI creating not just text, but images and videos, it's going to be very difficult to know what's real versus what's false unless we come up with much better strategies ourselves for being able to flag and identify that, right? I mean, so how will we know whether a photograph that's taken is a real photograph historically, or unless we develop technological or other tools that allow us to be able to disentangle real from false? I mean, I will tell you, I'm even starting to wonder, is that even going to have meaning anymore, like real from false, right? Because the more what we create is co-created with artificial intelligence, I think even our sense of what reality is will shift over time.
There's a Chinese proverb that is like, "May you live in interesting times,"
Right.
and I think that we certainly are. And of course, interesting is up to interpretation. Fascinating work that you're doing, Nita. I'd like to close out, if we may. So we've got a number of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that a student might take a crack at that is in this same discussion space?
Sure. So, I have been exploring in my work and in my most recent book, The Battle for Your Brain, this idea of cognitive liberty. And in the book, I took an approach which was really to look at the international human rights approach. That is, kind of what are the rights we need to put into place to safeguard people's both ability to develop self-determination over their brains and mental experiences, but also be safeguarded from interference with it. Kind of a regulatory approach that would recognize mental privacy and recognize freedom of thought to prevent interception, manipulation, and punishment for our thoughts. But I think where a lot of the work is going to need to happen, and the really interesting research questions are, what can we do individually that enables us to tell, fact from fiction? What kinds of mechanisms can we develop in our own brains that enable us to safeguard against, kind of manipulation of our mental experiences? Is there a way to not just engage critical thinking skills, but to, develop greater mindfulness or self-awareness that allows us to flourish in the digital age? And I think really interesting research questions are both from the kind of scientific to the technological to the, like, is it things like the, Twitter pop-up message that says, are you sure you want to share that? Or, do you want to read the article first? Does that in fact engage slower thinking? And does that lead to less sharing of misinformation, but also greater engagement of our mental processes that prevents manipulation? So I think those questions, which are, what are the limits of the human mind to be able to develop mechanisms to protect against, distortion of our cognitive freedoms? Those are some of the most interesting and challenging questions of our time, and some of the most interesting and important research questions of our time.
Would love to have you back on to the podcast at a future date to get an update on your research and your evolving thoughts in this fascinating and very important area. And with that, Nita Farahany, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, Visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.